The Blue Castle, Chapter 11. Remember, we're at a family dinner with all of the Sterlings. Meanwhile, the dinner in its earlier stages was dragging its slow length along, trimmed to sterling form. The room was chilly in spite of the calendar, and Aunt Alberta had the gas logs lighted. Everybody in the clan envied her those gas logs except Valancy. Glorious open fires blazed in every room of her blue castle when autumnal nights were cool, but she would have frozen to death in it before she would have committed the sacrilege of a gas log. Uncle Herbert made his hearty perennial joke when he helped Aunt Wellington to the cold meat. "Mary, will you have a little lamb?" Aunt Mildred told the same old story of once finding a lost ring in a turkey's crop. Uncle Benjamin told his favorite prosy tale of how he had once chased and punished a now famous man for stealing apples. Second cousin Jane described all her sufferings with an ulcerating tooth. Aunt Wellington admired the pattern of Aunt Alberta's silver teaspoons and lamented the fact that one of her own had been lost. "It spoiled the set. I could never get it matched, and it was my wedding present from dear old Aunt Matilda." Aunt Isabel thought the seasons were changing, and couldn't imagine what had become of our good old-fashioned springs. Cousin Georgiana, as usual, discussed the last funeral and wondered audibly which of us will be the next to pass away. Cousin Georgiana could never say anything as blunt as die. Valancy thought she could tell her, but didn't. Cousin Gladys, likewise as usual, had a grievance. Her visiting nephews had nipped all the buds off her houseplants and chivied her brood of fancy chickens. "Squeezed some of them actually to death, my dear." "Boys will be boys," reminded Uncle Herbert tolerantly. "But they needn't be rampageous animals," retorted Cousin Gladys, looking round the table for her appreciation of her wit. Everybody smiled, except Valancy. Cousin Gladys remembered that. A few minutes later, when Ellen Hamilton was being discussed, Cousin Gladys spoke of her as one of those shy, plain girls who can't get husbands, and glanced significantly at Valancy. Uncle James thought the conversation was sagging to a rather low plane of personal gossip. He tried to elevate it by starting an abstract discussion on the greatest happiness. Everyone was asked to state his or her idea of the greatest happiness. Aunt Mildred thought the greatest happiness for a woman was to be a loving and beloved wife and mother. Aunt Wellington thought it would be to travel in Europe. Olive thought it would be to be a great singer like Tetrazzini. Cousin Gladys remarked mournfully that her greatest happiness would to be free, absolutely free from her neuritis. Cousin Georgiana's greatest happiness would to be to have her dear, dead brother Richard back. Aunt Alberta remarked vaguely that the greatest happiness was to be found in the poetry of life, and hastily gave some directions to her maid to prevent anyone asking her what she meant. Mrs. Frederick said the greatest happiness was to spend your life in loving service for others, and Cousin Stickles and Aunt Isabel agreed with her. Aunt Isabel with a resentful air, as if she thought Mrs. Frederick had taken the wind out of her sails by saying it first. "We are all too prone," continued Mrs. Frederick, determined not to lose so good an opportunity, "to live in selfishness, worldliness, and sin." The other women all felt rebuked for their low ideals, and Uncle James had a conviction that the conversation had been uplifted with a vengeance. "The greatest happiness," said Valancy suddenly and distinctly, "is to sneeze when you want to." Everybody stared. Nobody felt it safe to say anything. Was Valancy trying to be funny? It was incredible. Mrs. Frederick, who had been breathing easier since the dinner had progressed so far without any outbreak on the part of Valancy, began to tremble again, but she deemed it part of prudence to say nothing. Uncle Benjamin was not so prudent. he rashly rushed in where Mrs. Frederick feared to tread. "Doss," he chuckled, "what's the difference between a young girl and an old maid?" "One is happy and careless, while the other is happy and hairless," said Valancy. "You have asked that riddle at least 50 times in my recollection, Uncle Ben. Why don't you hunt up some new riddles, if riddle you must? It is such a fatal mistake to try to be funny if you don't succeed." Uncle Benjamin stared foolishly. Never in his life had he, Benjamin Sterling, of Sterling and Frost, been spoken to so, and by Valancy of all people. He looked feebly around the table to see what the others thought of it. Everybody was looking rather blank. Poor Mrs. Frederick had shut her eyes, and her lips moved tremblingly, as if she were praying. Perhaps she was. The situation was so unprecedented that nobody knew how to meet it. Valancy went on calmly eating her salad, as if nothing out of the usual had occurred. Aunt Alberta, to save her dinner, plunged into an account of how a dog had bitten her recently. Uncle James, to back her up, asked where the dog had bitten her. "Just a little below the Catholic Church," said Aunt Alberta. At that point, Valancy laughed. Nobody else laughed. What was there to laugh at? "Is that a vital part?" asked Valancy. "What do you mean?" said bewildered Aunt Alberta, and Mrs. Frederick was almost driven to believe that she had served God all her years for naught. This is hilarious. This is amazing. Aunt Isabel concluded that it was up to her to suppress Valancy. "Das, you are horribly thin," she said. "You're all corners. Do you ever try to fatten up a little?" No. Valancy was not taking quarter, nor would she give it. "But I can tell you where you'll find a beauty parlor in Port Lawrence where they can reduce the number of your chins." The protest was wrung from Mrs. Frederick. She meant her tone to be stately and majestic as usual, but it sounded more like an imploring whine. And she did not say, "Doss." "She's feverish," said Cousin Stickles to Uncle Benjamin in an agonized whisper. "We thought she seemed feverish for several days." "She's gone dippy, in my opinion," said Uncle Benjamin. "If not, she ought to be spanked. Yes, spanked." "You can't spank her." Cousin Stickles was much agitated by the idea. "She's 29 years old." "So there is that advantage, at least, in being 29, said Valancy, whose ears had caught this aside. "Doss," said Uncle Benjamin, "when I am dead, you may say what you please. As long as I'm alive, I demand to be treated with respect." "Oh, but you know, we're all dead," said Valancy. "The whole Sterling clan. Oh, some of us are buried and some aren't yet. But that's the only difference." "Doss," said Uncle Benjamin, thinking it might cow Valancy. "Do you remember the time you stole the raspberry jam?" Valancy flushed scarlet with suppressed laughter, not shame. She had been sure Uncle Benjamin would drag that jam in somehow. "Of course I do," she said. "It was good jam. I've always been sorry I hadn't time to eat more of it before you found me." "Oh, look at Aunt Isabel's profile on the wall. Did you ever see anything so funny?" Everybody looked, including Aunt Isabel herself, which of course destroyed it. But Uncle Herbert said kindly, I wouldn't eat any more if I were you, Doss. It isn't that I grudge it, but don't you think it would be better for yourself? Your stomach seems a little out of order." "Don't worry about my stomach, old dear," said Valancy. "It's all right. I'm going to keep on eating. It's so seldom I get the chance of a satisfying meal." It was the first time anyone had been called Old Dear in Deerwood. The Sterlings thought Valancy had invented the phrase, and they were afraid of her from that moment. There was something so uncanny about such an expression, but in poor Mrs. Frederick's opinion, the reference to the satisfying meal was the worst thing Valancy had said yet. Valancy had always been a disappointment to her. Now, She was a disgrace. She thought she would have to get up and go away from the table, yet she dared not leave Valancy there. Aunt Alberta's maid came in to remove the salad plates and bring in the dessert. It was a welcome diversion. Everyone brightened up with a determination to ignore Valancy and speak as if she wasn't there. Uncle Wellington mentioned Barney Snaith. Eventually somebody did mention Barney Snaith at every Sterling function, Valancy reflected. Whatever he was an individual that could not be ignored. She resigned herself to listen. There was a subtle fascination in the subject for her, though she had not yet faced this fact. She could feel her pulses beating to her fingertips. Of course they abused him. Nobody had ever said a good word of Barney Snaith. All the old wild tales were canvassed. The defaulting cashier, counterfeiter, infidel, murderer, and hiding legends were thrashed out. Uncle Wellington was very indignant that such a creature should be allowed to exist at all in the neighborhood of Deerwood. He didn't know what the police at Port Lawrence were thinking of. Everybody would be murdered in their beds some night. It was a shame that he should be allowed at large after all that he had done. "What has he done?" asked Valancy suddenly. Uncle Wellington stared at her, forgetting that she was to be ignored. Done? He's done everything! What has he done? Valancy repeated inexorably. What do you know that he has done? You're always running him down, and what has ever been proved against him? Hi, Mashi. I don't argue with women, said Uncle Wellington, and I don't need proof. When a man hides himself up there on an island in Muskoka, year in and year out, and nobody can find out where he came from or how he lives or what he does there, that's proof enough. Find a mystery and you find a crime. The very idea of a man named Snaith, said Cousin Sarah. Why, the name itself is enough to condemn him. I wouldn't like to meet him in a dark lane, shivered Cousin Georgiana. What do you suppose he would do to you? Asked Valancy. Murder me, said Cousin Georgiana solemnly. Just for the fun of it, suggested Valancy. Exactly, said Cousin Georgiana unsuspiciously. When there is so much smoke, there must be some fire. I was afraid he was a criminal when he first came here. I felt he had something to hide, and I am not often mistaken in my intuitions. Criminal? Of course he's a criminal, said Uncle Wellington. Nobody doubts it, glaring at Valancy. Why, they say he served a term in the penitentiary for embezzlement. I don't doubt it. And they say he's in with that gang that are perpetrating all those bank robberies around the country. Who say? Asked Valancy. Uncle Wellington nodded his ugly forehead at her. What had gotten into this confounded girl anyway? He ignored the question. He has the identical look of a jailbird, snapped Uncle Benjamin. I noticed it the first time I saw him. A fellow by the hand of nature marked, quoted, and signed to do a deed of shame, declared Uncle James. He looked enormously pleased over managing to work that quote in at last. He had been waiting all his life for the chance. One of his eyebrows is an arch and the other is a triangle, said Valancy. Is that why you think him so villainous? Uncle James lifted his eyebrows. Generally, when Uncle James lifted his eyebrows, the world came to an end. This time, it continued to function. How do you know about his eyebrows so well, Doss? Asked Olive, a trifle maliciously. Such a remark would have covered Valancy with confusion 2 weeks ago, and Olive knew it. Yes, how? Demanded Aunt Wellington. I've seen him twice, and I looked at him closely, said Valancy composedly. I thought his face the most interesting one I ever saw. Well, there's no doubt there's something fishy in the creature's past life, said Olive, who began to think she was decidedly out of the conversation, which had centered so amazingly around Valancy. But he can hardly be guilty of everything he's accused of, you know. Valancy felt annoyed with Olive. Why should she speak up even in this qualified defense of Barney Snaith? What had she to do with him? For that matter, what had Valancy to do with him? But Valancy did not ask herself this question. They say he keeps dozens of cats in that hut up back on Mistatoise, said second cousin Sarah Taylor, by way of appearing not entirely ignorant of him. Cats. It sounded quite alluring to Valancy in the plural. She pictured an island in Muskoka haunted by pussies. Haunted by pussies. This was definitely not written in this day and age. I'm sorry. That's a funny one. Wish that was you? Moshi. Moshi for shame. Where was I? She pictured an island in Muskoka, haunted by pussies. That alone shows there's something wrong with him, decreed Aunt Isabel. People who don't like cats, said Valancy, attacking her dessert with a relish, always seem to think that there is some peculiar virtue in not liking them. Even in the 1910s, we were having this debate. That's amazing. You could say that right now today, it would still be true. That's fantastic. This is a timeless work right here. The man hasn't a friend in the world except Roaring Abel, said Uncle Wellington. And if Roaring Abel had been kept away from him, as everybody else did, it would have been better for some members of his family. Uncle Wellington's rather lame conclusion was due to a marital glance from Aunt Wellington, reminding him of what he had almost forgotten, that there were girls at the table. If you mean, said Valancy passionately, that Barney Snaith is the father of Cecily Gay's child, he isn't. It's a wicked lie. In spite of her indignation, Valancy was hugely amused at the expression of the faces around that festal table. She had not seen anything like it since the day, 17 years ago, when at Cousin Gladys's thimble party, they discovered that she had got something in her head at school. Lice in her head. Valancy was done with euphemisms. Poor Mrs. Frederick was almost in a state of collapse. She had believed, or pretended to believe, that Valancy still supposed that children were found in parsley beds. What a stupid woman. Implored Cousin Stickles. I don't mean to hush, said Valancy perversely. I've hush-hushed all my life. I'll scream if I want to. Don't make me want to. And stop talking nonsense about Barney Snaith. Valancy didn't exactly understand her own indignation. What did Barney Snaith's imputed crimes and misdemeanors matter to her? And why, out of them all, did it seem most intolerable that he should have been poor, pitiful little Cecily Gay's false lover? For it did seem intolerable to her. She did not mind when they called him a thief and a counterfeiter and jailbird. But she could not endure to think that he had loved and ruined Cecily Gay. She recalled his face on the 2 occasions of their chance meetings, his twisted, enigmatic, engaging smile, his twinkle, his thin, sensitive, almost aesthetic lips, his general air of frank daredeviltry. A man with such a smile and lips might have murdered or stolen, but he could not have betrayed. She suddenly hated everyone who said it or believed it of him. When I was a young girl, I never thought or spoke about such matters, Doss, said Aunt Wellington crushingly. But I'm not a young girl, retorted Valancy, uncrushed. Aren't you always rubbing that into me? And you are all evil-minded, senseless gossips. Can't you leave poor Sissy Gay alone? She's dying. Whatever she did, God or the devil has punished her enough for it. You needn't take a hand too. As for Barney Snaith, the only crime he has been guilty of is living to himself and minding his own business. He can, it seems, get along without you, which is an unpardonable sin, of course, in your little snubocracy. Valancy coined that concluding word suddenly and felt that it was an inspiration. It is, girl, go off. Snubocracy? Let's go. Snobocracy. That is such a good word. That's like a high tier word. That is one I could use at my own family dinners. Snubocracy. Oof. That was exactly what they were, and not one of them was fit to mend another. Valancy, your poor father would turn over in his grave if he could hear you, said Mrs. Frederick. I dare say he would have liked that for a change, said Valancy brazenly. She's boss girling so hard. So hard. Okay, I'll take a quick break for a second here, just to discuss what we're reading. Because I'm loving it, okay? I'm liking it a lot. Normally, I'm not a girl boss kind of guy, right? Normally, when I see someone girl bossing, it's usually someone just being kind of awful to well-meaning people in their life, and they're just kind of, taking advantage of that niceness to be really mean to people who don't deserve it. This is rightfully telling people off for actual sins that they are committing. Like, yes, it is wrong to gossip about people. It just is. And it's so very satisfying to see this poor woman who has been put upon for 29 years of life finally saying something about it because she's known better this whole time. And it's so satisfying. Like, okay, because this is in the Christian sense, let's speak in the Christian sense. Are these hypocrites, or are these people failing to live up to their own morals? These are hypocrites, because they're not even attempting to live up to their own morals. Yes, they are sinners, Mashi, exactly. If you are excessively mean to someone who holds a high standard for themselves and constantly fails it, you're being cruel. But if you are correcting of a hypocrite, everyone with good sense around you will see that and think you better for it. To put it in a different example, right? I've gone on record a couple times about this, so I don't mind talking about it. But pornography is an evil in this world. It hurts people. Hurts the people who make it, hurts the people who consume it. It's bad for you. It's bad for you. I hold that exceptionally high standard for myself. Do I always meet it? No. I often fail it, fully knowing that I am doing harm to myself and others. That doesn't make me a hypocrite, because it's not like I'm trying to seek this stuff out or preaching a standard I don't expect myself to live up to. It's that I have set an exceptionally high standard that I myself am failing to live up to because it is exceptionally high. That standard is still an excellent standard. So it would be cruel to approach someone in that situation and call them a hypocrite, because they are trying. It is not cruel in this example, what Valancy is doing, because they aren't even beginning to attempt to be the people they say they are. That's why this is such a satisfying and funny and just beautifully written scene. Like, this is just fantastic writing. There are so many things that were set up in the last 10 chapters that are culminating and colliding right now in a super satisfying, and it's in a way that everyone reading it can feel very personally connected. Everyone has these people in their family. Valancy just has the misfortune to have it be her entire family. But everyone has these people. So this is These are bad people. They set up standards for other people. They don't pretend to abide by themselves. And because of that, they go around stomping down anyone who doesn't live up to their standards. And the one standard that they hold for other people that they can't abide holding for themselves, the crux of the story is that maidhood. It's that Valancy is 29 and single. Olive, you might notice, is also around the same age, and she is single. Yes, she's got a man, and he's planning on proposing to her, and her first husband tragically died. But they don't apply any of the same pressure to her. This is hypocrisy, and that's why this is such a satisfying moment here. Sorry. I don't mean to overinterpret the book. It's just that this is one of those clear examples where something is being written extremely well. And because it's written so well, you get so many delicious layers out of it, and you can apply it to so many things and actually learn from it. Sorry. I'll keep going on like that if I don't stop. When you read books, you normally don't think about it that deeply. It's so cool to hear someone analyzing it in that kind of way. It's genuinely super interesting. Well, thank you, Mashi. And I will say this. It is good to analyze what you're reading and to stop and think about it and try to put yourself in the character's shoes. It's a great way to learn empathy if you're having trouble with that. Not saying you are, Mashi, but just in general, royal you. But also, if you were to pick up this book and read it cover to cover, this is the kind of really great, deep, powerful writing where I don't think you need to analyze it. I think everyone would come away with an implicit knowledge of what's happening here, even if they couldn't explain it. There's a lot, and I want to say this too. There are a lot of people in this world who are looked down on because they hold good morals, but they can't explain their morals. And they're good people, but they're not taught enough, or they're just not of a disposition to be able to explain why they believe what they believe, like I'm doing right now. That doesn't make them bad people. It doesn't make them hypocrites or liars. It just means that they have an implicit understanding that they can't put into words. And that, to me, is kind of beautiful, because there's a certain amount of faith dipped into that, where even if you don't know that you can fully understand it yourself, you understand that good things are good and bad things are bad, and you will go forward with that. Sorry, I will legitimately spend the rest of the day doing this. This is just an excellent scene, but also something I can see on the teleprompter. We're about to get into something more interesting, so I'm gonna keep it moving here. So to get back to it, "Doss," said Uncle James heavily, "the 10 Commandments are fairly up to date still, especially the 5th. Have you forgotten that?" "No," said Valancy, "but I thought you had, especially the 9th. Have you ever thought, Uncle James, how dull life would be without the 10 Commandments? It's only when things are forbidding that they become fascinating." But her excitement had been too much for her. She knew by certain unmistakable warnings that one of her attacks of pain was coming on. It must not find her there. She rose from the chair, saying, "I am going home now. I only came for the dinner. It was very good, Aunt Alberta, although your salad dressing is not salt enough, and a dash of cayenne would improve it." None of the flabbergasted, silver wedding guests could think of anything to say until the long gate clanged behind Valancy in the dusk. Then, "She's feverish. I've said right along she was feverish," moaned Cousin Stickles. Uncle Benjamin punished his pudgy left hand fiercely with his pudgy right. "She's dippy, I tell you, she's gone dippy," he snorted angrily. "That's all there is about it. Clean dippy." "Oh, Benjamin," said Cousin Georgiana soothingly, "don't condemn her too rashly. We must remember what dear old Shakespeare says, that charity thinketh no evil." "Charity poppycock!" snorted Uncle Benjamin. I've never heard a young woman talk such stuff in my life as she just did. Thinking about things she ought to be ashamed of, much less mention. Blaspheming, insulting us. What she wants is a generous dose of spankweed, and I'd like to be the one to administer it. Uncle Benjamin gulped down half of a scalding cup of coffee. Do you suppose that the mumps could work on a person that way? Wailed Cousin Stickles. I opened an umbrella in the house yesterday, sniffed Cousin Georgiana. I knew it betokened some misfortune. Have you tried to find out if she has a temperature? Asked Cousin Mildred. She wouldn't let Amelia put the thermometer under her tongue, whimpered Cousin Stickles. Mrs. Frederick was openly in tears. All her defenses were down. I must tell you, she sobbed, that Valancy has been acting very strangely for over 2 weeks now. She hasn't been a bit like herself. Christine could tell you. I have hoped against hope, but that it was only one of her colds coming on. But it must be something worse. This is bringing on my neuritis again, said Cousin Gladys, putting her hand to her head. Don't cry, Amelia, said Herbert kindly, pulling nervously at his spiky gray hair. He hated family ructions. Very inconsiderate of Doss to start one at his silver wedding. Who could have supposed she had it in her? You'll have to take her to a doctor. This may be a brainstorm. There are such things as brainstorms nowadays, aren't there? I suggested consulting a doctor to her yesterday, moaned Mrs. Frederick. And she said she wouldn't go to a doctor. Wouldn't. Oh, surely I've had trouble enough. And she won't take Redfern's bitters, said Mrs. Frederick. Or anything. She's determined to go to the Presbyterian Church, said Cousin Stickles, repressing, however, to her credit, be it said, the story of the banister. That proves she's dippy, growled Uncle Benjamin. I noticed strange about her the minute she came in today. I noticed it before today. Uncle Benjamin was thinking of Mirazh, Miraz. I have no idea what that means. It's in parentheses. I have no idea. What is Miraz? Is that just a timely reference lost to time? I'll have to look that up later or something. That's so strange. Miraz? Everything she said today showed an unbalanced mind. That question, was it a vital part? Was there any sense at all in that remark? None whatever. There was never anything like that in the Sterlings. It must be from the Wansbaras. Poor Mrs. Frederick was too crushed to be indignant. I never heard of anything like that in the Wansbaras, she sobbed. Your father was odd enough, said Uncle Benjamin. Poor Pa was peculiar, and Mrs. Frederick tearfully. But his mind was never effective. He talked all his life exactly as Valancy did today, retorted Uncle Benjamin. And he believed he was his own great-grandfather born over again. I've heard him say it. Don't tell me that a man who believed a thing like that was ever in right senses. Come, Amelia, stop sniffling. Of course Dawes has made an terrible exhibition of herself today, but she's not responsible. Old maids are apt to fly off on a tangent like that. If she had been married when she should have been, she wouldn't have got like this. Nobody wanted to marry her, said Mrs. Frederick, who felt that somehow Uncle Benjamin was blaming her. Well, fortunately, there's no outsider here, snapped Uncle Benjamin. We may keep it in the family yet. I'll take her over to see Dr. Marsh tomorrow. I know how to deal with pig-headed people. Won't that be best, James? We must have medical advice, certainly, agreed Uncle James. Well, that's settled. In the meantime, Amelia, act as if nothing had happened and keep an eye on her. Don't let her be alone. Above all, don't let her sleep alone. Renewed whispers from Mrs. Frederick. I can't help it. Night before last, I suggested she'd better have Christine sleep with her. She positively refused and locked her door. Oh, you don't know how she's changed. She won't work. At least she won't sew. She does her usual housework, of course, but she won't sweep the parlor yesterday morning. Though we always sweep it on Thursdays. She said she'd wait till it was dirty. Would you rather sweep a clean room or a dirty one, I asked her. She said, of course, I'd see something for my labor then. Think of it. Uncle Benjamin thought of it. The jar of potpourri. Cousin Stickles pronounced it as it was spelled. Oh. The jar of potpourri has disappeared from her room. I found the pieces in the next lot. She won't tell us what happened to it. I should never have dreamed of it, Doss, said Uncle Herbert. She has always seemed such a quiet, sensible girl. A bit backwards, but sensible. The only thing you can be sure of this world is the multiplication table, said Uncle James, feeling cleverer than ever. Well, let's cheer up, suggested Uncle Benjamin. Why are chorus girls like fine stock razors? Why? Why? Asked Cousin Stickles, since it had to be asked and Valancy wasn't there to ask it. They like to exhibit calves, chuckled Uncle Benjamin. Cousin Stickles thought Uncle Benjamin a little indelicate. Before Olive, too, but then he was a man. Uncle Herbert was thinking that things were rather dull now that Doss had gone. I like Uncle Herbert. Uncle Herbert, he's the one who married into the family, if I remember. And he's, like, got kind of a head on his shoulders still, and he's kind of a decent folk. That's the end of chapter 11. That was half of our reading today. Good gosh. Four more chapters we're going to get to today. Oh, but that was fun. That was such a good chapter. Best one yet, actually. All of the setup from the first 10 collided beautifully in that one. From her kind of, like, not fully realizing it, but, like, being displayed to the readers that she was in love with Barney Snaith. The kind of muck around. Hope you don't fall asleep. Moshi, you will be fine. Moshi, slap your cheeks. Come on. All right. Think of anything except Pussy Island and you will stay awake. Or think of Pussy Island and you'll stay awake. I don't know.